Well, it's 9:02. I think we're ready to get started. Um, for our communications team, I think I see Steve on the screen. Should we show the whole panel? Okay, well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon for people from different continents that are tuning in for this webinar that we're hosting today. My name is Yun Sun, and I lead the Myanmar project here at the Stimson Center with my colleague Steve Ross, who has been leading the Crisis in Rakhine State project. Stimson has had a long dedicated history to the study of Myanmar's domestic politics and external relations. First founded in 2013, our Myanmar project has been covering the analysis of ethnic conflicts, civil-military relations, resources exploitation, illicit economy, great power competition, as well as regional dynamics related to the domestic changes inside Myanmar. Most of the team have not been able to travel to Myanmar since the coup of 2021, especially if you don't count visits to the border regions as a visit to the country, the regions that are currently not under the control of the military. However, we have had the benefit of having our own non-resident fellow Amira Diha, who is based in the country and provides us with the most authentic reflection of the development on the ground. Here, I would like to thank you all for taking the time and joining us for this timely discussion of perhaps the most consequential event in Myanmar in recent years. Since the military coup that happened exactly 5 years minus 1 day ago, the military declared a state of emergency that have given it the legitimacy to run the country, and subsequently extended 7 times. When the state of emergency was finally lifted last July, the military had 6 months to organize a general election and finally move the country out of the military rule, so to speak. And so the elections came in 3 stages since the end of December last year. By now, the polling has been, according to reports, the polling has been completed. However, the result is not as clear as people thought it would be. There's no doubt that the military-backed USDP, Union Solidarity and Development Party wins. We have seen that from the information made publicly available about how USDP takes a quote-quote sweeping victory in what observers and media have called a quote-quote sham election because of all the restrictions, exclusions, changes of the rules that we have seen the military crafted for this election. But the details of that victory, of that sweeping victory, is lacking. For example, how many seats have they won, has USDP won in the federal parliaments? How many of those elected MPs came from the military originally? Well, people generally believe this election is the military's effort to consolidate its control. Has the consolidation really been successful? Or we're looking at further political fragmentation within the military, and now potentially between the military and the political parties. This is not unprecedented. For people who lived through that period, people might recall that Dua Shriman, who was number 3 of the military before 2011, moved on to the parliament and became the speaker, and subsequently launched his own political career as parliamentarian, characterized by major disagreement with the military. So does this election mean, what does this election mean for the Burmese military as the old guards, if you will, are shuffled now into the political sphere? Are the younger generations rising going to share the same aspirations as the previous leadership? I hope people will agree with me that more questions rather than answers have emerged from this election and about Myanmar's political future. To discuss them, we have set up 2 panels of the best experts on Myanmar to share with us their assessment. The first panel will focus on the election itself, the context under which the election happened, the process of the election, and the political dynamics reviewed throughout the election. The second panel will focus on the election's implications for different stakeholders, especially the military, the resistance, including the ethnic armed groups, as well as ASEAN. The majority of the panelists are either based in the region or frequently travel to the region. They're going to present some of the best analysis in this field. I won't read through the full bios of our speakers, but just to give you a sense of the tremendous expertise we have on this first panel. To begin with, we will have Steve Ross, who is a senior fellow of Stimson Center, leading the Crisis in Myanmar's Rakhine State project. He's an expert on conflict, mediation, and governance with a particular focus on South and Southeast Asia. He was most recently a senior advisor and a program director at the Richardson Center for Global Engagement. But previously, he was also based in Myanmar for Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and he also worked intensively on the Carter Center's election observation mission for the 2015 election. Following Steve, we're going to invite Amra Tiha, who is a non-resident fellow with the China program at the Stimson Center. He's currently a doctoral researcher at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, taking part in in a number of the projects that they have launched on Myanmar. He's also a Young Leaders Visiting Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. Previously, he was a research director at Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security. Last but not least, we're going to invite Mr. Nyenda Maulin to give us his reflection about the election from his observations very closely to the country. Nyenda is the principal of ACNAT Initiatives, originally founded to foster policy dialogue and enable a culture of collaboration through future thinking. In the aftermath of the military coup in 2021, he has provided strategic and high-impact counsel to key political stakeholders that designed and mobilized various political and policy initiatives and convened collaborative networks of thought leaders and change makers focused on the future of the country. So I understand that our original invitation, we have invited Mr. Min Zin to share with us his observation from ISP, but due to a scheduling conflict, he is not able to join us today. That's why we have invited Nyenda to join us. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the screen to Steve, my colleague, to share with us his observation about this election. Steve, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yun. Before we dive into the results and implications of the military planned elections, I think it's important first to provide some context on how Myanmar got to this point. Yesterday, as Yun mentioned, marked 5 years since the Myanmar military overthrew the democratically elected government over baseless allegations of widespread voter fraud. The military detained leaders of the civilian government, blocked telecommunications, and declared a year-long state of emergency, expecting to hold new elections by February of 2022. The coup initially sparked large-scale and festive peaceful protests, as well as a civil disobedience movement during which hundreds of thousands of civil servants went on strike. When the Myanmar military began to crack down on the protests in March of 2021, it sparked an unprecedented level of armed resistance to the military as People's Defense Forces formed rapidly once the military's crackdown began. Conflict, which had previously been concentrated in the country's periphery, spread to the Bamar heartland. Whereas there were about 24 ethnic armed groups in Myanmar prior to the coup, ACLED now counts over 2,600 distinct armed groups, including village defense teams. And Pam, if you can go to the next slide, showing the map of changes in territorial control. Yeah, so here we see this on the map on the left is approximate territorial control 1 year after the coup in February of 2022, and then a map that was just released yesterday, again showing approximate territorial control in 2026. Obviously, you can see significant gains by ethnic armed groups and resistance actors in the west, in Rakhine State, in the northeast, in Shan, and in the southeast in Karen and Karenni, as well as in central Myanmar and in Sagaing. The military responded to both nonviolent and armed resistance with characteristic brutality, employing the Four Cuts counterinsurgency it has employed for decades, a form of collective punishment which seeks to cut enemies' access to food, funds, intelligence, and recruits. Over 90,000 are estimated to have been killed in the conflict in the last 5 years, including over 15,000 civilians, many of which were killed in indiscriminate airstrikes and raids, including attacks on hospitals, schools, weddings, religious sites, and camps for displaced persons. Driven by conflict and arson attacks that have destroyed over 100,000 buildings, internal displacement has increased 10 times since 2021, whereas there were 300,000 people internally displaced within Myanmar in 2021. There are now over 3.5 million people internally displaced, not including hundreds of thousands more that have left the country. Humanitarian aid is blocked to areas that the military does not control, even amidst natural disasters like last year's devastating earthquake or Cyclone Mocha in 2023. Over 30,000 political prisoners have been arrested. Nearly 22,000 remain in prison today, and an estimated 2,200 people have died in military custody. The coup has also had a significant impact on the economy. In 2021, in part because of the coup and in part because of the ongoing COVID pandemic, the economy shrank by nearly 20%, and it is now 16% smaller than it was in 2020. The poverty rate has doubled to nearly half the population. 1/3 of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance, and 1/4 of the population faces acute levels of food insecurity. Meanwhile, the informal and illicit economy has boomed. The drug trade, in part because of crackdowns in Afghanistan, Myanmar is now the world's largest producer of opium, an 80% of increase in land under cultivation since 2020, and is also a major producer of methamphetamines. There's also been an explosion of cyber scams, with Myanmar becoming a major hub for cyber scam centers, with estimates of well over 100,000 people working in centers across the country, particularly on the China-Myanmar border, and on the Thai-Myanmar border, many of whom were trafficked into the country. The scams have earned billions of dollars in revenue in just the last year, and despite superficial crackdowns, continue to proliferate. It was concerns because of these scams that led to a key turning point in 2023, Operation 1027. This was a major offensive that was launched with tacit support from China because of its frustration with the State Administration Council's inability or unwillingness to tackle the scam center issue on the China-Myanmar border. This was a particularly important offensive because, in my view, it pushed key stakeholders off the fence. Among ethnic armed groups, it brought some of the most powerful armed groups into the fight. Most had not been engaged directly, but were providing training, weapons, and safe haven to other resistance actors, and led to some of the unprecedented military gains that you see on the screen in this map of approximate territorial control. And brought significant resistance to the Burmese heartland. In addition, I'd say it pushed China off the fence. China had initially taken a fairly laissez-faire approach to the earlier days of the coup, and the Operation 1027 brought some degree of tacit support for this offensive. But over the last year and a half, since August of 2024, China has swung much more significantly behind the military. So as a result of this offensive, China initially brokered a ceasefire in January 2024, but this broke down within a few months. And a second phase of Operation 1027 led to the fall of Northeastern Command in Shan State, the first time that a regional command had fallen since independence, with ethnic armed groups and allied resistance forces reaching the outskirts of Mandalay and demonstrating an improved capacity for collaboration between ethnic and Bamar armed actors. This led to a fear of regime collapse from China, and a major move by China to swing behind the regime, starting with a visit by China's foreign minister to Naypyidaw in August of 2024. That subsequently led to a combination of both direct and indirect Chinese pressure, and that in combination with military adaptations, including the enforcement of a conscription law for the first time, leading to over 100,000 people having been conscripted since April of 2024, the increased use of airstrikes and drones, and better integration of Myanmar military forces has allowed the Myanmar military to shift the momentum of the fight over the past year. That in turn led to a ceasefire brokered by China between the Myanmar military and the MNDAA in northern Shan in January 2025, and subsequently a bilateral ceasefire again brokered by China with the TNLA in northern Shan in October of 2025. So the Myanmar military has regained significant strategically significant territory through 2025, particularly in Shan State and Mandalay, but it has still lost much more territory than it has regained in that time. In parallel, and also under pressure from China, the SAC began to move toward holding elections, starting with a flawed census in October 2024 that covered less than half of Myanmar's townships. The push towards bilateral ceasefires and counteroffensives throughout the past year were driven largely, I'd say, by a desire to among the military to hold elections in as many places as possible in the hopes of increasing their perceived legitimacy. So despite pledges to hold elections within the first year of the coup, the military continually extended a state of emergency every 6 months until last July, after which the SAC announced plans for elections and the SAC transformed into the SSPC, the State Security at Peace Council. So looking at the framework for the 2025-2026 elections that were just held, as Yun mentioned, they were held in 3 phases, with one phase every 2 weeks, beginning December 28th and concluding on January 25th. Just 6 parties contested the election nationally and 57 parties overall. The requirement that parties re-register under the SAC led to the dissolution of political parties that won 90% of the seats in the 2020 elections, including the Aung San Suu Kyi-led National League for Democracy, which itself won 83% of the seats in the 2020 election and 68% of the votes. For its part, the Union Solidarity and Development Party put forward 1/5 of the total candidates for this election, with a large number of active and retired military participating. In addition, there were significant changes to the electoral system. For the first time, a mixed first past the post and proportional representation system was introduced for the upper house of parliament and state and regional parliaments. Electronic voting machines were introduced for the first time, with concerns about transparency over how they would actually count the votes. And election protection law was introduced to stifle criticism over the elections, with over 400 charged under that law so far, in addition to an increase in surveillance more broadly. So during the elections, as a result of this widespread conflict, elections were canceled completely in 67 of 330 townships. Pam, if you could go to the next slide. And you can see here the map of where polling was and was not held. And the red is where elections were canceled, and that includes those 67 townships where elections were canceled completely, as well as 4,000 ward and village tracts where elections were canceled, even in the 263 townships where elections were held. Sagaing, I think, in the Bamar Heartland is exemplary of the extent to which there were challenges in holding the vote. Although elections were officially allowed in 11 townships in phase 2 of the voting, voting was conducted in only 63 out of 505 wards and village tracts, which represents just 12% of the wards and village tracts. And sort of exemplary of how difficult it was to hold the elections, as well as low interest in the elections among the Myanmar population. Only about 13 million votes were cast in this election, compared to 27 million votes cast in 2020. There were attacks by resistance forces throughout the electoral period in each phase of the elections. But the military does seem to have benefited somewhat from canceling elections where attacks were more likely to occur. Um, the level of voter turnout is reported at about 55%, but even that masks the extent to which there was low interest. There was significant pressure on individuals to participate in voting, alleged threats for those who might not have wanted to vote, including concerns about restrictions on freedom of movement, access to passports, that they might be compelled to partake in the conscription effort. And this, in combination with the turnout reflecting only the percentage of people who voted where elections were held and not the entirety of the population, sort of overstates the extent to which turnout was even at 55%. So this is the context in which the three phases of the election were held, amidst widespread conflict, ongoing contestation for control over much of the country, a flagging economy, and a system designed to deliver victory to the military proxy USDP to win, as well as amidst growing Chinese influence and leverage over the country. I'll just conclude by saying that despite the failure of the elections to adhere to even some of the most basic norms, it will have an effect on elite politics and forthcoming policy in Myanmar. It will require ethnic armed groups and resistance forces to adapt, and it will likely lead to an increase in international engagement with the regime that emerges from the elections, particularly among Myanmar's neighbors. I look forward to the remarks of Nyanta and Amara on the results and to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you for that useful and comprehensive overview of the context of this election. So it gives people a much better sense as for what are exactly the representativeness of this election. But like Steve, you said that this is going to have an impact over the internal political landscape and the external engagement landscape, nevertheless, regardless of the legality of this election. So for the next, I would like to invite Amra first to give us a sense of, in your observation, how has this election changed anything? Or if it doesn't change anything, what are the political implications that we're looking at? Does it change anything? Amra, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So before we talk about the changes in trajectory, let me talk about the state of the play that what I've seen it in the past a few months ago. So of course, 2025 election, 2026 election will not going to change the regime or the political system. That is, we all widely interested. So I will not focus much on it, but I will focus on what's that mean in the future and the trajectory, and based on the situation that I'm making assessment. So one thing for sure is what we have experienced right now, the fragmentation that we have experienced is the highest in the modern history, the largest number of armed resistance groups ever, the highest number of active combatants, and the highest level of sustained conflict. So if we compare with 1988, during that mass movement, 88 revolution and the armed resistance, the number we have seen in the past 5 years in threefold, at least the number of combatants is threefold. If you compare it 1948, that is more than tenfold of the armed combatants. So this is, you can see the number of combatants. In that context, the election is kind of calendar thing and institutional reframing into kind of fragmentation. So it is somehow create the institutionalizing fragmentation in another set of system. That is what I've seen it. So in the country, inside the country, what I've seen and when I talk with the different stakeholders and interlocutors, most actors treated election not as a moment of going to somewhere else, but it's a kind of moment that they reposition themselves. It is not about winning or losing in the conventional way, but it's about how are they going to relevance in the current system and the possible fragmentation and decentralized situation after that. And that is not only talking about those who compete in election, but those who are resistant on the ground are seeing and how they're gonna repositioning and how they're gonna see in the future. And that is what I seen it, and that is more clearly seen in the violence and the conflict in there. So we expect during the election time, there will be armed violence. And then we monitor. during the polling station environment. We don't see much in the polling station in the urban area, but actors still pushing it on, but not on the polling station. But they focus more on the logistic corridor and the focus more on the strategic hubs. So this is an idea that they are not attacking or they are not rejecting on the election. They think this is a kind of process, but they are trying to make it sure they hold and consolidate something before the new calendar system of institutionalized fragmentation coming in. This is, I call, is an inward turn. They all looking inward. At the same time, there's also fragmentation and contesting and power sharing within the the military, and that is lower groups with the BGF and different political militias are looking on to what extent they can control in what area, to what extent they will get the power sharing. So this is a kind of bargaining within the regime itself, and also within the resistant forces. How are they going to react with the newly formed administration in some pockets in the central part? So inside the regime, it's the same thing that there will be a lot of generals who compete in the election, and they are now part of the USDP as an institutional entities, and they were working on the USDP part, and some generals who consider they were simply appointed, and then we are not sure whether USDP are now taking the major lead in the parliaments. So this is another form of things that we're going to see in the election part. So this is what is a paradox in here, right? The elections at the center of former political calendar, but it's barely shows the real balance of power, but it's more like, a stage where existing hierarchies are renegotiated, both within the regime and also within the resistant force, and they try to consolidate within their own area they already have, and they try to looking on how are they going to react with the upcoming mechanism to have a systematic relevancy in the upcoming years. So just, putting few step backs and see what's the trajectory in there. So what we see in the trajectory is not on the election result, but with the economy and social issue that gonna be play in that fragmented situation. So now the control and political authority is more localized, and the authority is uneven and asymmetric in different areas. And the system is setting and overlapping claims out there. It's nationwide. Even in the urban area, you will see the different level of overlappings and different level of political authorities are there. So the real contest is not about now about the inward bargaining, and it's about the controlling territorial thing, revenue sharing between the different camps, and how to reach the national settlement out of it as a kind of the secondary objective. So this is what situation in right now. So based on this kind of situation, what we are seeing is four different pillars that's shaping the trajectory. The first one is a USDP. So we don't know exact number because the pool results are coming out slowly, and then there are a lot of contestation out there. But we are sure that USDP win about 90%, and then that is more than what they got in 2010 election. What they even say that was the most staged and election ever. But now they even win more than that, and that create the USDP as a more like a gatekeeper of the institution in the upcoming regime. So we usually say USDP and the military is a two side of the same coin, but it's not always the case, especially in the past 5 years. So one important point is USDP provided all the necessary administrative agencies during the past 5 years. They are the primary source of human resources to the military in the past 5 years, and they provided all the political, how can I say, escape route from the military in the past 5 years, and that they also one of the earliest political parties to pushing for the election there too. So the idea is they said we try so hard to make this thing happen, and we try so hard to win the election. And they also accommodate at least 200 retired military seniors for the secure seat. So they say we accommodate a lot, and now we win the election. So we will not simply going into the design of the senior general design it, but we need to create some form of negotiation and bargaining. Of course, we may give up the presidential position, but we may not simply give up all other areas that we need to renegotiate. That this is some kind of thing inside the USDP and military start to looking at each other and trying to negotiate on it. So this is something that we're going to see in there. So this lead to the possible scenario like the Deng Sherman scenario, or maybe there can be another scenario like, where the Deng Shui transition to power after 18 months, the whole system is, changing to another different political trajectory. That is something that we don't know. It can be even better or the worse. That's the one part. The second part is ERO situation. So when the military or the regime or the central administration have a legitimacy deficit, all the EROs gain more than they have. So that is a clear historical pattern we've seen in 1948 and 88 and also in 2010, 2015. So they get more advantage from negotiation. And then we also should not forget that, EROs negotiated many times the central administration in the past 5 years. Major negotiations are made and major mediation were reached, made and agreements are reached. This is another part of it. This is something we're going to look at. The third one is, now everyone is looking on the opening of the corridor and resource sharing part. So this is where we're going to see more that all the negotiations are now based more on the resource sharing and tax revenue, both on the border area and also on the central plain, that, conflict economy is always intertwined. That is something that's going to shape in the post-election trajectory. And then, of course, geopolitics that we all, Steve also mentioned, the Chinese involvement and so on. So what we are seeing is the post-election trajectory in the past 18 months is about recalibration, finding on the relevancy, trying to reconsolidate, and everyone is trying to position how to deal and making a deal with the central administration to get the most out of it. That is what I've seen as a trajectory after the post-election. Thank you.
Thank you, Amra. I forgot to mention that you are the only one who is on the ground in Myanmar that lived through this election while it is happening. So your observation about how the polling is going and how the country internally, the narrative has been, I think that's just tremendously valuable. And what you have noted about the USDP, if I can summarize, you're basically saying that USDP and Tatmadaw are looking at increasing split between these two political organs, that they might have shared some origins and the military have lent power to USDP. But now USDP is winning this election, they're not necessarily want to carry water according to Tatmadaw's dictation. And I think that raises a fascinating question about what the future narrative or the future dynamics between the military and the political party will look like. But before we go to the discussion, I want to remind our audience that you are welcome to use the Q&A function to send in your questions, to post them. We have a team of staff that's monitoring your questions, and we will come to them after we invite Mr. Nyenda Maolin to give us his observations. He was very close to the country while the election happened, so I think he has some unique perspectives in terms of what has happened. Nyenda, the screen is yours. Thank you so much for joining us while you were on travel.
Thank you, Yansan. Thank you, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be able to join you all. I think Amara and Steve have covered most of the concrete facts regarding the sham elections that took place. I largely concur. I think the best way to think of this is that this is a very carefully, or an attempt to carefully orchestrate a transition internally within the Naypyidaw regime, where for the past 5 years, in addition to facing resistance, opposition, and outright war across multiple parts of the country, there's also been a severe consolidation and concentration of power with the commander-in-chief, who is also the, if I'm not wrong, the interim president, acting prime minister. And the central question, I think, for Naypyidaw is, can they at least, as a preliminary step, I think, Amara, that's what you're saying. This is a step. Can this be a step to at least diffuse power and create new decision-making centers that are not just in the hands of a single individual? I'm not particularly optimistic about the prospects for these. We have to wait and see. I don't think anybody can speak with any real authority on what the sequence will be over the coming months. But we have a rough idea that there is the intent to set up to at least no longer rely on at least these 6 monthly declarations of state of emergency. At least there's some kind of parliamentary body within which, carefully contained, you have a military-friendly number or dominant group of MPs that maybe create space. But the central issue is all of this is happening in a way that doesn't address the fact that the country is still in conflict, right? There is still war. And undoubtedly, there must be some planning on how whatever regime or whatever administration follows will address that central problem. But without addressing the fact that the country is at war, it is very hard to see the military, its leadership, its current leadership, so easily relinquish control, right? I had, this idea I think presented earlier that maybe this creates some space for new economic approaches, some different kinds of policy making. All of that, all the difficult and all the problematic policies that exist today with regards to the economy, with things like conscription, with how the current regime treats the exchange rate, imposes penalties on traders. All of this is driven by the fact that this is a country at war, and those current body of policies are geared towards helping Naypyidaw run a war economy. And without a sufficient indication of how this regime or the next administration, whatever form it looks like, how they seek to address it, the central fact that this is a country at war, those policies are very hard to, I think, disentangle and will ultimately still drive control to the top of the military. So I think the main thing to, it's hard to talk about hope, but can there be a leadership transition of sorts within the military itself, if not other parts of the Naypyidaw infrastructure? Meaning, can there be a change in the role of the commander-in-chief? Can there be new faces that come to the table? I think that's one of the things to watch out for, because that to me will signal to what extent can those in Naypyidaw who have tried to push through this very problematic and very, again, illegitimate process. They're trying to achieve something wholly different, right? They don't really care about legitimacy. I don't think the calls you hear from outside about we all know this is fraudulent, this is a sham. This is not meant to address any of that. These sham elections, they're not meant to respond to that. They're attempting to respond to something much more internal. Now, in that goal, will they succeed? To me, the litmus test is whether there's a change in the commander-in-chief role, whether we see actual challengers, in a sense, to who makes decisions at the top in Naypyidaw. And then I think things will follow from there. The resistance that you've seen emerge over the past 5 years has also, in a sense, struggled to figure out the right response, I think, to these sham elections. But broadly, what you can say is, to me, it's a signal of how little it seems to matter at the moment, right? In outside of Naypyidaw, let's put it that way, going back to Steve's map. For most actors, the question is, will there be new faces? Will there be a new dynamic emerging from Naypyidaw? Whether that's partial fixes or freezes to the current conflict, like Amara has suggested, in terms of resource sharing, fragmented governance approaches, call it what you will, or something much more structural in terms of finding a path out of conflict. This, I think, a lot of the resistance actors will have to wait and see. The one thing that these sham elections make difficult is for the NUG, right? The NUG has been You can say sort of the challenger to the regime in Naypyidaw over the past 5 years in terms of popular sovereignty, legitimacy of sorts, but also much more hard outcomes in terms of resource revenue raising and generating, building out a pretty significant military capability and provisional governance across different parts of the country. The issue is the NUG also has many limitations, especially vis-a-vis other resistance actors, more traditional ethnic armed or resistance organizations. And the Naypyidaw sham elections, what they will do is raise hard questions to that body in terms of its standing. Maybe I'll stop here, Yan.
Thank you, Ninda. Thank you for unpacking some of the implications that we're already seeing and all the questions that have remained unanswered. So we welcome people to send in your questions. We already have a number of them, but if I can just pose the first question, I'm going to ask a question that seems to be on everyone's mind. What do you think is going to happen to Myanmar, since he has basically single-handedly steered the direction of the nation since 5 years ago, or even longer than that? What do you think that he is going to position himself to be, or that this is not going to change very much? Steve, would you like to go first? Thank you.
Sure, I'll start, and then yeah, very curious to hear what Amara and Nyanta think as well. Min Aung Hlaing has had designs on the presidency for a long time, going back to at least 2015 and probably beyond that. I think he craves the legitimacy that comes with that role. So I think it would not be surprising if, as coy as he has been since the start of the electoral process about his interest in the role, I think it would not be surprising if he seeks that out. But I think the questions posed by Nyanta and Amara about elite politics and negotiating over what that means for the other hat that he's currently wearing, the commander-in-chief role, and whether or not there will be some new entity or structure that's created that allows him to continue to control both the military and the quasi-civilian government. I think that's really going to be a key to answering what Nyanta asked around potential alternate power sources and new policies that could emerge. Right now, it seems, I think, quite difficult to imagine a scenario like 2010 where you have the kind of factionalization between different power sources in the way that it emerged then, just because the center of power is much smaller now. It's a much tighter circle of advisors, and I think there is a reluctance to cede the power that's been accumulated over the past 5 years.
Absolutely. Amara, you have discussed a few options for him in the past. Would you like to share? Thank you.
I agree with Steve. That there are at least three options. The first option is, just rushing on the presidency. That is that everyone wanted, everyone looking for. But this is, in this situation, is a bit tricky position. Even he rushed for the presidency. I mean, they need to share certain amount of cabinet positions and the lower house speakers to the USDPs and all other positions. So the power is not that really consolidated anymore, and that even lead to the difficult in the budgetary and the other parts in the later in the parliamentary part. But there can be also another situation like state consular law that is already there before, so he can still using the state consular like Aung San Suu Kyi keeping the CNC position, or maybe he can use the design that was planned in the 2010 that was never happened because of some leaders in 2010 election, they don't agree to go on. So that kind of guardian council and something can be going on. But what the most important part right now is, it's not about the presidency or not. It's about who is going to, succeed in the commander-in-chief position. That is the most important part. You need to make a secure in your, home ground. So there may be some form of arrangement that the president or the certain executive role may somehow be still in the military institution. This kind of power relation and design will be coming up that we expected in upcoming weeks that, that that may not require to go through the parliamentary positions. Like, for example, they will use the military, different kind of military laws that can create their own committees, and then they can try to bring up executive role that Myanmar is going to hold in that position, so he can go on both part at the same time.
Great. Nyenda, which option do you think he's going to choose, or are there other options?
I think it's still hard to say. I think there's a lot of I'm sure there's pressure for a change of the guard, so to speak, at the top of the military. I've said this over and over again. I think this is institutionally, this is the most insecure, psychologically vulnerable leader at the top of the military in its history. And you see this in how he, at an individual level, his relationships with the men, mainly men under him, his decision making, all of his entire approach, right, over the past 5 years speaks to that almost psychic insecurity. So will he feel confident that he can hand over? I think that's the central question. I don't know if it's been decided, but if you look at the military, there are not too many individuals who could play that role, because the central question is not only will whoever theoretically replace him, not only that do they not threaten Myanmar, but you also need a commander-in-chief to which the rest of the organization will follow, right? This is in the military's history, I don't think you've seen so severely challenged a body in terms of internal order and discipline, in terms of defections, in terms of just the fragmentation of the chain of command. Never on this scale, I would say. And whoever comes to replace Maryland will also have to undo a lot of what has been broken. But again, none of this solves the central problem for Myanmar, and I don't know if Myanmar still holds on to that. The ambition to be president is almost stripped of any of the responsibilities and the context, right, and the needs that come with that role, in the sense that Myanmar faces a country that in 5 years, if he assumes the presidency, has a severely, as an economy that has basically collapsed or spiraled, that has severe sense of insecurity across large parts of the country. The conscription, the conflict, all of this have pushed out large numbers of young people outside the country. Infrastructure has frayed or essentially collapsed, right? Because of war, but also because of natural disasters that the regime over the past 5 years has not been able to sufficiently address. And for the military, I mean, the central question is what kind of standing does this organization that has seen itself at the center of Myanmar politics since its founding, what kind of role will future military leaders see themselves holding, right? How do they compel people to join, right? How do you maintain the primacy of its officer corps? There are things they can do, of course, to incentivize that, but really, it's not quite the same appeal, if we can put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And who are the new leaders of the military? It does not seem to be very visible at this point, a question that people have been asking. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the questions from the audience. To start with, there is a very striking and interesting question about, do you think it is possible for Myanmar to experience what happened to Syria? That a sudden movement from the military or from one of the political forces that topples the leadership and claim the country. Is it possible? Anyone who would like to give it a try?
I'll give it a try. I
Sure.
I would say never, in the sense that ultimately, to me, one of the key factors is the economy, right? So the economic situation has really, really gone so bad, but also within the military, right? The opportunities for rent and extraction that uh, served its sort of doctrinal cogency, all of that has really come under severe challenge. On top of course, having to deal with a leader at the top who constantly, is putting pressure on you, and in such a weakened economy, it's not as appealing. And the country is really only held together for the past. I would say Naypyidaw has really only financially held together for the past year and a half because of significant capital injection and this kind of extractive economic policies that I mentioned earlier, treating the economy as a war economy. But that's not sustainable for very long, right? And you have what they've done with the very arbitrary, trade licensing systems, the arbitrary caps on the exchange rate, all the other the conscription, driving out labor, all of this has been very bad for the economy, number one, and it's not sustainable. And at some point, that can always be a point of
A
friction.
tipping point.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Turning to the next question, I think Steve, you will be in a perfect position to answer this one. So Council on Foreign Relations put the military control of territory somewhere assessed as 21%. I think it could be slightly higher than that, but not much higher. So how does this lack of control and instability affect the regional dynamics and international relations of Myanmar? That the military essentially is not in control of the full country, but they are acting on the international arena as is legitimate government.
Yeah, thanks. I think there are a couple of dynamics at play here. I think that with the increase in control by ethnic resistance actors along the borders in particular, it's led to a movement towards a little bit more of a two-track system than existed previously. I would say China has always had strong relations with both actors along the border, including ethnic groups and the power holders in the center in Naypyidaw. And that has those relationships have deepened in the last 5 years on both sides. I think you've seen a little bit of a replication of that strategy among Myanmar's other neighbors, with Thailand and India both privileging the relationship with Naypyidaw over the relationship along the border, but paying much more attention to border dynamics given the instability that has come as a result of the increase in conflict. So concerns about refugees, about scam centers, about the movement of illicit goods, about conflict spillover more broadly, has pushed a bit of a balancing in how they are engaging with actors in Myanmar, both border actors that the military is at odds with, and the authorities in Naypyidaw. But and that extends to Bangladesh as well, whereby you've seen continued privileging of the relationship in Naypyidaw, but tentative steps towards outreaching to the Arakan Army, which has taken over the entirety of the Bangladesh-Myanmar border in 2024. I would say what I think the neighbors are concerned about the most is the potential for collapse from the center, and the belief that a collapse from the center will lead to further chaos, fragmentation, and further complexity in Myanmar. And I think perhaps there are significant challenges that are facing some of the parallel governing structures that have emerged in border areas and in some heartland areas. But I think neighbors do not recognize those as sources of stability. And the challenge for those armed groups and for the resistance actors more broadly is to demonstrate an alternative to a center as the primary provider of stability.
Thank you, Steve. I think you really point out a key reason that people don't often see behind the neighbors' willingness to accommodate the center of Myanmar, the military and its regime, which is the prevention of collapse. That if the country completely collapses, it will be even a bigger, messier chaos for the neighbors to handle. I think that really drives their policy towards the country. At least that's what I see from the Chinese perspective. That's what's driving their behavior. A question from Lex. Hi, Lex. NUG becoming irrelevant? Everyone agree, or we think that there are still roles that NUG could play? Amara, would you like to give it a try? Sorry, it's a tricky
Sure.
one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a kind of expectation management, I thought, right? I mean, different stakeholders have a different expectation on NUG. Some people want us a kind of coordination body. Some want as a more like a, the vanguard of the revolution. Some consider as a parallel administration. So given in this context, right? I mean, it's a very difficult to put where to put NUG. But if you're looking on the how they're performing as a state, as a parallel administration, at some part they are quite successful. But if you're looking as a more like a coordinator and engaging with the different ethnic arms to create a vanguard, they are still struggling. So I think it's a matter of expectation and what they really want to see NUG in the future. I think so.
Yes, what do people want to see from NUG? And what does NUG want to see from themselves, given the current circumstances? A question that raises an interesting comparison between the 2010 election and the elections that we just saw. And while we know that the Stimson government from 2011 to 2015 pursued a reformist approach to domestic governance and to their international relations, and many people, I mean, policy practitioners would describe that period as almost a golden period of Myanmar's positive change. So now we have another election, and the military again was in charge of that election, and the government, you could argue, is also the government to be created is also going to be originated from the military. So, do you anticipate that a similar situation, similar to the Stimson government, arise again? There are obviously many differences, but do you see that as a possibility or not very much? Steve, would you like to give it a try first?
Sure, I'll jump in first. I think for me, one of the key differences is what both the military and what we could broadly characterize as resistance or ethnic resistance actors have learned from the last 5 years. And in 2010, I think there was sort of a willingness to give the emerging government the benefit of the doubt to an extent. The international community was behind it to an extent, and right now, I think what both sides have learned and what the international community has also learned is the other side can't be trusted. And so I think it's going to be much, much more difficult for the regime that emerges from the elections to be able to demonstrate that it is genuine in its intentions if it seeks to implement reforms, and so it will be much harder for them to convince the general population that their intentions are genuine. And on the flip side, I think that the military has learned from the last 5 years that it needs to double down on the three national causes and concerns around disintegration of the union, and that the border areas are something to be suppressed or managed rather than collaborated with. So I think that's going to be a key challenge that is different this time around than previously. Obviously, there are other major differences with the economy in the state that it is, with the international community and structures breaking down more broadly, the impacts of that on potential reconstruction and support in terms of foreign assistance that could be mobilized if there is a cessation of hostilities. And then just conflict is much more widely spread. The contestation of control is very significant across wide swaths of the country, and it seems to me that trajectory is likely to continue. That there will continue to be contestation both in the heartland and on the periphery for this foreseeable future.
I agree. The amount of benefit of the doubt that people inside Myanmar and countries outside Myanmar are willing to give to the country seems to have decreased significantly. And whether their confidence can be rebuilt somehow, I think that's a very big, very, very big if. Same question to Amara. Maybe would you like to weigh in as for whether you see a possibility that maybe a reformist approach could re-emerge again?
I want to mention about 2 points. The first one is, the reform in 2015. The reform started around end of 2011, early 2012, not in 2010. So that was the outcome of the different institutions that were set up even before the elections, that's supported by the international different think tanks and agency for 2010 election and going on. But we don't see much right now. So that's the one part. There will be no political entities inside to do this kind of technical support to the regime if they even want to perform the reform. That's the one part. The second part is, but the same time, whether they are intention to doing or not, it's one of the interesting part is, the generals who retire from the military and now taking the USDP platform, when they perform and when they do the campaign, they only refer to Thein Sein administration and they say we will do reform like in Thein Sein consistently, even on the Facebook and even on the public media. So they use Thein Sein period as a kind of gold standard to they say we are going to do this and that, but we are not sure how to what extent they can do it with this current form of fragmentation and conflict trend, resource constraint. And another most important part is, there is no low-hanging fruits right now in Myanmar to claim, international actors that they achieve something easily. So I think it will be a bit tricky to do it right now.
Agree. Nyanda, a question related to this. Do you think that the resistance will continue fighting, especially the ethnic armed groups, that this election is not going to change the battlefield development or the battlefield strategies? Would you agree with that assessment?
I think the capacity to continue is still there, but it's also been severely curtailed, right? China's policy shift over the past year and a half, if that's the right way to put it, is not just throwing its support behind Naypyidaw for the sham elections, but also making it tougher, right, in terms of logistics, supply chains, access to banking and other. It's able to assert quite a bit of leverage to a lot of the northern groups, and I think it has done so, and I think that has made things quite challenging. But nevertheless, you have seen, even in the past month, in the central Myanmar, in Sagaing, Magui, you've seen the resistance slowly move now onto the main roads and arteries. I think this is in line with what Amara is saying, and is able to still take those transport, networks and come out onto the to major transport hubs, right? So you still see a capacity there, but the cost has been high. The cost has been high for everybody over the past 5 years, which is why if there's going to be a pivot on the resistance, the problem is I don't think there's any reliable indication that the military is going to be stepping back from its offensives. And therefore, you don't see yet the space emerge for let's say a different approach, right? So the capacity is curtailed, but still there. Let's put it that way. And then in terms of whether this can be a repeat of the 2011, 2015 reform period, it goes back to the same thing. To me, it can't, because fundamentally the country is still at war, right? In 2011, there was a much more secure, confident military, and you had a emergent, a new administrative construct that created in a very managed way something that the international community could deal with, engage with, that EAOs, EROs could engage with. We do not see that yet, and I think that really depends on leadership in Naypyidaw.
Absolutely. Also, under Denson government, there was a very significant space for international engagement and for Western organizations to play a role, right? And currently, we have not seen that space being opened. So perhaps the military is still assessing that possibility. And also, I would like to make a note that we did extend the invitation to speak on this platform to NUG and to a number of representatives in the resistance. I think there are multiple conflicts of schedules that have prevented their participation. We have about 3 minutes left on this panel. And I would like to ask a question that while we ask what's going to happen to me online, what his plan is. And there's a question from the audience about Aung San Suu Kyi, because I think people have not forgotten about her, that she has been under house arrest. She has been under some very serious criminal charges by the military government. So what do you think is going to happen to her? Very quick responses to this question. Who would like to give it a first try? I'm going to ask Steve.
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I mean, I think that the potential carrot that the military can wield to release Aung San Suu Kyi or to put her under better conditions of house arrest is always there. And I think that possibility increases with improved regime security, potentially after the elections. But I think it's not it's important not to underestimate how much personal animosity there is from Min Aung Hlaing towards Aung San Suu Kyi, and how that has prevented her release or better conditions to date. And that includes significant pressure from the likes of China, Thailand, others who have sought meetings with Aung San Suu Kyi and been denied. So I think that should not be underestimated. I will also say that I think that she still commands significant support from within the Myanmar community, particularly with the Bamar community. But that dynamics on the ground over the past 5 years have in some ways moved beyond her, and that she potentially has a role to play as an important symbolic figurehead if she is released. But it's very hard to see her reemerging in a similar way and with a similar degree of support as she was able to muster in 2012, 2015, 2020.
Absolutely. She is over, if I remember correctly, she's over 80 at this point, right? And as a politician, that could have implications. Amra, would you agree that her future seems to be quite gloomy at this point?
Uh, uh, I mean, if as soon as she come back, she will be still a superstar, right? I mean, there's no doubt. But her age and able to mobilize and performing as like the last election will be very difficult at this age. And also then the way that people's reacted, the activism in the border area resistance force are also changing the way that Steve said. But I think the majority of the peoples are still waiting her to coming out. And I think there may be some form of arrangement will coming up, but Aung San Suu Kyi usually never ever signed the parole in her life, so I think she will never come out with the parole, only with the full,
The
full
full
release.
pardon, a
Full,
full release. Yeah. Nyanda, would you agree? You have the last words.
On Aung San Suu Kyi, I think she has still a tremendous popular support base, right, in large parts of the country, not just the Bama, but in, let's call it cosmopolitan Myanmar, right? All the urban central parts of the country. I actually, this is something that the military could and historically has played, right? But the fact that, to Steve's point, it's some of this animosity is so personalized at the top. You don't even see that under consideration. Because frankly, if they wanted to, there are many ways in which you've seen the military in the past use Aung San Suu Kyi, and she, of course, she has to be a willing participant in such a game. But time is running out, and still there's no indication of that or any other major strategy regarding the crisis emanating from Nebula.
Thank you. Thank you all for those realistic assessments. Well, I want to thank our panelists for a fantastic discussion in the first panel. We're going to take a 10 minutes break, but please do come back for the second panel where we're going to focus on the specific impact on the political stakeholders in the Myanmar landscape. So we'll take a break for now, but we'll see you in actually 8 minutes. Thank you again.
Hello.
Hi, Titinan, how are you? Good evening.
Good. Good. How are you?
Good, good. How is everything? Is everything okay?
No complaints.
That's a very positive messaging because we can always complain.
It's meant to be negative. It can be, it's actually lots of things going on, but it could be worse.
I like that. I like that. And we should use that as a title. It could be worse.
Yes, worldwide. I mean, we have election this coming week, this coming Sunday. So lots of things going on here. Thailand is not going in the right direction. But let's see what the election holds for us. Yeah, and then, Myanmar. How was the first panel? I'm really sorry I missed the first panel because I had some commitment I had to attend to.
No worries. The first panel went very well. We dived into the political intricacy after the election and how it might affect the different party and different stakeholders' calculation.
Yeah, I mean,
So
so
yeah,
what has
as
really changed? I mean, has the election changed anything?
That is a good question. And let's see if the election also changes anything on the Thai or on the calculation of ASEAN countries. So I think we're at 10:20, so we're ready to get started again. I invite our speakers to turn on. Yes, there's Morgan and there's Mo. Hi, Morgan. Hi, Mo. How are you? Thank you. Well, thank you for everyone to stay on for the second panel, where we will dive into some of the specific implications that the election has had and will continue to have on key stakeholders. And here we're focused on three different groups or three different groups of stakeholders. We would like to invite Mo Dudar from the ASEAN to give us a reflection of how this election and its result might affect the old guards or the military and USDP. And then we're going to invite Morgan Michaels to give us an overview of how this election could impact the resistance dynamics and the momentum, not only the NUG, but also the ethnic armed groups. Last but not least, I'm going to invite Professor Dijinan to a keen observer of politics in mainland Southeast Asia, including Myanmar, to give us his assessment of does the election change anything externally, especially from an ASEAN perspective? Is it going to push ASEAN towards a more positive embracement of the Myanmar government after the election or not? I will refrain from reading through their biographies, which is on the event announcement, and you can read it. But just very briefly, all three speakers of this panel are longtime dedicated observers of Myanmar domestic politics and foreign relations. Um, Professor Mo Mozudar, she joined ICS in 2008, and she has been the lead researcher in the ASEAN Studies Center up to August of 2019. Um, and she spends a good amount of her research time on Myanmar's domestic politics and its foreign policy, as well as how does Myanmar fit in the ASEAN integration process. For Mr. Morgan Michaels, he is a research fellow for Southeast Asia Studies and Defense at IISS. He studies armed violence and transnational security threats with a particular focus on mainland Southeast Asia. I think you probably all recall, if you have not read it, IISS has the interactive mapping of the ongoing ethnic conflicts, armed conflicts going on in Myanmar. It has been extremely informative for outsiders to understand how the domestic civil war and the ethnic conflicts have evolved. And last but not least, Professor Dijinan, who is most well known for his studies on Myanmar domestic politics and how its impact over Southeast Asia. He is the director of the Institute of Security and International Studies and associate professor of international political economy at the Faculty of Political Science at the Chulalongkorn University. He has authored a very long list of articles, books, and book chapters on Thailand's politics, political economy, foreign policy, media, as well as ASEAN and East Asian security and economic cooperation. So with that, without further ado, I would like to hand over the screen to Mo to give us her reflection of what history has told us about the old guards and new guards in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoon. Good evening from where I'm sitting, and good morning to everyone tuning in DC, and good afternoon to everyone else in different time zones. Yoon, thank you for having me. It's always good to join Stimson Center panels, and of course, we have this collaborative thing going on to invite each other to the panel discussions that we do to contextualize the situation with regard to developments in Myanmar. I'd like to, start off first by recognizing that it's been 5 years. I know the first panel also mentioned this and talked about this. It's been 5 years since I think the promising trajectory towards more opening, widening of space, more democratization, all that has been disrupted. And it's also been 5 years since a very sustained pushback against yet another imposition of military rule was demonstrated. And, people have been saying this is the world's longest sustained resistance against a military coup. So at this juncture, 5 years after 2021, I just always like to recognize our thoughts are with the people of Myanmar who have once again spoken up. And that relates to the point that you wanted me to dive deeper into about historical parallels. Why is there such a rejection, such a pushback, and much more voices this time around about the military regime's election exercise, which people have rightly pointed out its orchestrated nature as sham. And that's because of those historical parallels. The election promises each time a military authority was in place in the seat of power, those promises made and those promises that were broken after elections had been held. I think those were the kinds of, historical parallels that people in Myanmar, the Myanmar people have. So I think that's the kind of preface that I'd like to make before I go into the 10 minutes that I have to share 3 broad points or thoughts, thought starter points, if you will, about, you talked about the old guard. I guess following from the previous panel's discussions, that would be the military. And of course, the military-backed political party that came into existence in the past decade. We could also call it the military's proxy, if you will, and that is the Union Solidarity Development Party, or the USDP. So the 3 points I really have is related to, is it trust or is it reliance when we talk about, this old guard, the military and its so-called political or civilianized arm, that is the USDP. The second point would relate more to, I think, the interest you had in about the tensions between the different sections or sectors of this old guard. And a third point would be my very poor attempt at crystal ball gazing into trajectory, which I think, the first panel also started with thinking about what might happen in the seat of power. So before I delve into that, may I just quickly share the screen about, just some reference maps. I like to tell stories in maps, and the maps that I'm going to show lead into my first point about the USDP has always, historically relied on the military's backing for votes and for electoral victory. And then let me illustrate that. By sharing, bear with me, please. Right, I hope people can see that. So what I wanted to do really with this is to show the electoral maps. This map that I'm hovering my mouse over is from the 2020 elections. And the areas in red are where the National League for Democracy won with a landslide. This little inset actually shows the electoral map from the 2010 elections. The areas in green are the USDP wins. So basically, we do know that 2010 was the orchestrated transition according to the previous military regimes, so-called roadmap towards a the seven-step roadmap to democracy, and its anointed successor was the USDP. So this actually shows the 2020 electoral map more clearly. Then the 2021 coup happened. So I am sharing this with the permission of Morton Aung, a young Kachin politician, who put this together in the first month of the coup in 2021 to show the number of townships in Myanmar that had spoken out against the coup. And if you look at that with the previous electoral map, you'll see pretty much the sentiments on the ground. And have they changed? Well, I don't think they have changed that much. And this is a map that Steve also showed in the first panel, but it really, I think, highlights the point to which the current military regime's administrative reach, is there or not. And this is a map that's been put together using data from the regime's Union Election Commission by the DVB, the Democratic Voice of Burma. So the election results, I know they're still being compiled, but if we look at the winning parties for the lower house, for the upper house, and for the regional parliaments, of course, we see this preponderance of the USDP. And from the sources, the contacts, our key informants in Myanmar that we've been talking to, it's basically in areas where people felt, they had to vote for the USDP or had some kind of coercion. But in areas where there were really, people who came out to vote and voted for the ethnic political party is where there are these seats that you will see, these pockets of the more ethnic-based political parties winning seats and so on. So I was listening very intently to the previous panel's discussion, and I think that's how the election outcome might have been affected. This little infographic is from the Data for Myanmar page, and it really shows that there are these core so-called supporters who would have been voting for the USDP at every election, and there are some electors who would be firmly supporting other political parties. And of course, there are not many other political parties under this current orchestrated exercise that is called an election. And then there will be a layer of people who may be coerced to vote, but we don't know who they might cast their vote for. And then there are all these electors who are not intending to vote or who are in the conflict areas, quite roughly, who might be in those areas where polls have been cancelled. And it's the highest number of townships that have been cancelled this time around, as Steve's presentation has also mentioned. So those maps were just me trying to reinforce the story. The point I wanted to make, my first point about the USDP historically relying on the military's backing for votes. And it's not really surprising if you look at how it was, quote unquote, born from the military in 1993 as its so-called social arm. I was a young adult in Myanmar at that time, and I was really surprised in the way that this was mobilized. And it was all the more shocking in the way that membership was being actively sought, from civil servants and so on. Several civil servants managed to dodge it, but most felt that they had to join the party. Anyway, from its, those kinds of origins in 1993, it was called the Union Solidarity Development Association. The bigger shock, of course, came in 2003 when USDP, I'll just use the word thugs, were responsible for harming Dawn San Suu Kyi and her supporters in a convoy, in Debay in central Myanmar, which led to killings of over, I think, numbers put it at 70 plus. And of course, that also led to a lot of scrutiny by ASEAN at the time, and the junta of the day tried then to present its 7-step roadmap to democracy as a kind of maneuvering space or breathing space. But this is how the USDP had its origins, executing, I think, the wishes of the military towards its own political interest. So that's my first point. The second point relates to this, it builds on that, and that I call it tensions. Why? Because I think despite this kind of reliance or dependence, or actually being the kind of executor or implementer, it's at the same time, the USDP also seems not to be fully trusted by the military supremos or the executive, later, as we will see also in during the Thein Sein administration years. And why do I say this? I think we could already see it in the previous military regime supremo, Senior General Than Shwe, who basically orchestrated the whole democratic transition process, also mistrusting one of his anointed successors, Dura Shwe Man, who was widely slated to be the face representing the USDP in the orchestrated election of 2010. But I think Shwe Man's own ambitions, maybe his leaning towards a more reformist agenda, I think really led Than Shwe to go with Thein Sein. And the kind of reform process that Thein Sein initiated, I think Amara mentioned it, it was something in the works already, and it was something that I think the senior general could live with Thein Sein steering the course, maybe not going so radical as in terms of the reforms, but that kind of guided process that the military likes to say. So why? It's because, again, the military at that time, of course, Senior General Than Shwe, chair of the State Peace and Development Council military regime, he had intended to keep the USDP very much under a tight control to ensure or protect the military's interests, which were also, of course, his own legacy and survival interests. And we do see this also, this distrust somehow also adding into the split. We called it, I think it's referred to as the midnight coup in 2014 between Thein Sein and Dura Shwe Man, the power play. And this has been because Dura Shwe Man, who became Speaker of the lower house, if I'm not mistaken, was also very much asserting, pushing more check and balance and a more reformist agenda. And it's no secret that he was quite close and looked up to, I guess, Dawn San Suu Kyi and those broader reform moves. Maybe he was very clearly aligning himself with those. So that split also shows, I guess, the more military entrenched executive distrusting how the USDP might go, or certain USDP members might go rogue, and then that tight control. So with that kind of context, that brings me to my final point, and I apologize if I'm eating into other people's time, about the trajectory. And I know you asked this question in the first panel about, whether Minau line and the future executive role. Nobody seems to really want to commit to really talking about it. But if we look back to how several hundred retired military officers were parachuted into the USDP just before the junta's polls, and actually taking over the candidate roles in constituencies where USDP members had tried to work the ground, thereby, I guess, creating this kind of dissatisfaction. If you look at that, we do see that there have been rumors of, among these senior military officers who were parachuted in and so on. There have been rumors circulating in Naypyidaw that, retired generals Mya Tun-oo and Aung Lin Dwe might be appointed as speakers of the lower house and upper house, respectively. These are speculations. Now, if they potentially become speakers, then that kind of dynamic that we observed about the Speaker of the House presenting a more check and balance against the executive will also, I think, come into question as in terms to the trajectory and the potential tensions that you talked about. So I think we also need to be aware of that potential of, the speaker, the legislative and executive type of competition and rivalry, even if it's within the same ranks of the party. Of course, the USDP party will be the main, I guess, the political representative in the parliament, and adding to that the military vote. And of course, if you look also at, another, speculation is about the current USDP chair, U Kin-yi, and his role. It's clear that his role in the past, ever since he took the USDP chair role, was really as, the military's enforcer, enabler, even, assisting, I think, in 2021, in 2020, late 2020, 2021, with those kinds of protests and rallies about election fraud, which gave the military the pretext to stage the coup. So how will then Kin-ye's positionality be viewed in this future trajectory? He will be leading the USDP in parliament. He has this enforcer role as the USDP head. But then again, someone with that power, how will that sit with whoever is in the executive, and how strong would that executive be? I think are those kinds of questions that the first panel also addressed. So let me just add with this observation, which is of course open to discussion as well, about internal change among the old guard, whether it's the executive, the political, in the legislature, and the party that has historically relied on the military, but yet again now may be in a position to assert power. I think the senior general this time around has made really sure to place people indebted to him in one way or another in key positions. And I think that's something that we didn't really see that much to that extent in previous iterations. I'll stop here. I apologize if I've eaten into Morgan's and PJ's time, but that's the context from me.
No, thank you, Mo. This is really helpful. I think I really enjoy the reference to Zhuo Shuiman, because when he started to assert his position, which was not necessarily aligned with the military's position in the parliament as the Speaker of the lower house, I think it really raised the question that once the military leaves the military, do they still owe their allegiance to their previous institution, or they see new political landscape that they need to pursue, a new power that they need to pursue? Since this Amara also referenced to this, I think this is going to be a key element that we need to observe down the road. So in full agreement with you. And for next, maybe I can invite Morgan to share with us his assessment of how the resistance is going to change because of this election. I understand that the resistance is a very broad framework with many groups under the category, whether it's NUG or PDF and the EROs, and which EROs are you talking about? So Morgan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Yoon, and thanks to Stimson for having me today and for organizing this very timely panel. Let me begin by saying that I think the elections overall offer a moment for actors to recalibrate their strategies if they choose, but that I don't think elections are necessarily deterministic in and of themselves. I think we need to consider the wider structural context in which the elections are situated. And so that's what I'll try to do first. And then I'll discuss, I think, some possibilities that could come out of the elections moving forward. So To start with my very broadest assessment, I think that the Tamada is here to stay. I don't think that it faces the threat of military defeat in the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean that the conflict won't be dynamic. I think there'll be offensives and counteroffensives and surprises as time continues, but I'm less concerned personally with measurements of territorial control or the ability of the opposition to disrupt different mechanisms or security parts of the security apparatus. I think as long as the Tamada survives, it will be able to hold the country hostage through bombardment, through blockade, and through immense violence. And so I think that this is the fundamental starting point and reality that we should base our analysis of the possibilities that the election do or don't offer moving forward. To reiterate, I think generally that the conflict is in a stalemate. So I base this assessment on 4 broad structural parameters. The first is access to firepower and resources. The military has plenty of this. It's never really struggled. If you look at since the coup, despite economic headwinds and sanctions, resource-intensive activities like airstrikes have increased exponentially. In the country right now, there's a broad ammunition shortage for opposition forces, and they're really struggling in that regard. Second would be great power policies. Obviously, China, others have spoke about this. China's policy currently favors the Tamada. I think fundamentally, China's policy is about border security and maintaining an equilibrium between the buffer forces on the border, which are the EAOs, and the central state apparatus. If the military begins to re-encroach on the periphery, it's possible that China could recalibrate. But again, I think it would be a recalibration towards equilibrium and not a push to overthrow the central state apparatus, which is controlled by the Tamada. The U.S. is obviously a power that could influence the trajectory of the conflict, but right now I just don't see any evidence that it's planning to do that. The third, would be the regime's cohesion. Obviously, this is an interesting one to watch. I think we have to differentiate between tension between the Tamada itself and the USDP. But overall, in my opinion, the Tamada remains resolute and stubborn as ever, and relatively cohesive and willing to continue fighting on. In contrast, the opposition is increasingly fragmented, and there exists no coalition or alliance capable of replicating the gains seen during Operation 1027 on a nationwide scale, which is what you need to overthrow the Tamada on the battlefield. The last one would be personnel. Obviously, most of the viewers will be aware that the Tamada suffered serious shortages of manpower, but it's largely rectified that now through conscription. Not only has it rectified that, but it's using conscription to now enhance the overall size and force capability of its forces, rather. Conscripts appear to be fighting effectively, in my opinion. Many of the gains in the past year have been won by units that are comprised largely of conscripts. I haven't seen any evidence of mass desertion or defection. Opposition groups obviously have plenty of personnel, but they're at saturation point in the sense that they can't necessarily equip everyone who's willing to fight. So if these broad structural parameters continue, my assessment continue for, let's say, in the long term or medium to long term, then my assessment is that the Tamada will eventually regain its militarily dominant position in the country. So post-elections, what can we expect from the Tamada? I think, firstly, the Tamada, we should expect renewed offensives. The Tamada has recalled some of its forces to protect polling areas. Those will now be freed up. And we can expect the Tamada to try to reshift the center of gravity from the center of the country back into the ethnic periphery. So in other words, to bring the fight back into the ethnic peripheries. It will focus on logistics lines, cutting supply lines for the opposition groups, especially those that extend from ethnic areas into central areas or from different ethnic areas to different ethnic areas. Importantly, it should be noted that the Tamada has always used a combination of military force and negotiation and concession as a part of its strategy for managing armed opposition. So I think what the Tamada, I agree with Nyentha and Amara that the elections are fundamentally an inward-facing exercise. And I think beyond coming to a new internal consensus about the leadership dynamic, it's also about finding a more sophisticated and better way to exert your power and rule the country. Let's be honest, bombing your opponents every time they disagree with you is not a very sophisticated way to rule the country. So the military does likely intend to offer tactical or strategic concessions to some extent. Again, not because it wants to make peace, but because it wants to manage armed dissent and opposition in a more sophisticated way, and that involves negotiation. Still, we can make assumptions about some red lines that the Tamada likely has. For example, I don't think that the Tamada will accept EAO footprints in areas where, in Bama areas or in areas where EAOs in the previous era did not have strong footprints. So for example, I don't think the Tamada will accept a permanent TNLA foothold on the border of Mandalay. I don't think the Tamada will accept a permanent AA position in southern Rakhine or in Ayeyarwady. So irrespective of what other concessions it's willing to offer, I think there will be some areas where we'll see military offensives no matter what, unless they can force a negotiated withdrawal. So this leads to the EAOs. I think that the moment, like I said, offers the opportunity of recalibration for the EAOs. The Tamada is not the only actor with the agency to use political negotiation, maneuvering, manipulation, building patronage networks, political process, peace process, etc. It's not the only actor. It doesn't have a monopoly over that. Opposition groups could also use those tools, not as capitulation, but as competition against the military in a new arena. And historically, I think in some cases, opposition groups have had significant success in using this tactic. So if opposition groups do decide to negotiate, generally speaking, there's two things they could do. One, they could just try to freeze the conflict entirely, freeze it along the current lines of demarcation, and then you go back to your base, you rearm, you re-equip, you improve your finances, and you wait to fight another day. That's one possibility we'll likely see with some groups. The second thing you can try to do is you can try to consolidate the gains that you've achieved so far through ceasefire followed by political bargaining. This is what we saw with the MNDAA. The MNDAA, the ceasefire with the MNDAA is not only a ceasefire, but actually it's also a bit of a political bargain. The MNDAA has achieved de facto recognition of its authority over an area larger than Special Region 1, which is originally what it sought to gain. Here, there'll be an early bird gets the worm dynamic in that opposition groups that choose to enter into this type of bargaining are more likely to get a better deal because the Tamada will have an incentive to make a deal with those groups, and then it will free up some bandwidth to turn and redirect its focus against groups that are refusing to engage in talks. The second option, of course, besides talks for opposition groups, would be to continue along with the status quo, which more or less would mean maintaining armed struggle. And in this case, what you have to hope for is that you'll be able to maintain your armed struggle and your revolution long enough to see a significant change in one of those broader structural parameters that I referred to earlier. This is obviously the riskiest strategy because one, you cannot predict these changes. Some of these changes happen at the global geopolitical level. It's impossible to predict them. We cannot predict China changing its priorities, for example. Sorry. The second thing is that these parameters can also shift in favor of your opponent. So that's another part of the risk. And the longer you try to hold out, the worse, the pressures continue to mount. So as we've seen the pressures over the past 5 years, civilian fatigue, that's been visible in the cities for several years. I think the population conflict fatigue is worsening in other parts of the country now as well. The fragmentation is obviously worsening. So there's risks involved in continuing with this strategy. At the same time, opposition groups have a sunk cost dilemma in that it's going to be very hard for them to justify publicly to their supporters a change in strategy that entails either accommodating or negotiating with the regime, because this is obviously very different than what they've promised, which is total system overhaul or regime overthrow. And so in those cases, I think that some of the groups could enter into a sort of state of strategic paralysis in which We don't necessarily see major conflict moves, but we also don't really see any kind of turn towards negotiation. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you for unpacking the different strategies potentially we will see from different groups because they have different positions. They also have different advantages. But I'm particularly fascinated by what you said about Tatmadaw unlikely to accommodate EAO's presence in territories that they previously were not occupying. Because to me, that suggests potentially intensification and escalation of conflicts if Tatmadaw is keen on pushing, like imagine pushing AA out of the Southern Territory in Rakhine State. So that's unlikely to be achieved on the negotiation table. That most likely will have to be achieved in the battlefield. But we can save the discussion to a little later. Here, I would like to encourage our audience to raise your questions using the Q&A functions for our later discussion. But before that, last but not least, let's go to Professor Thitinan to give us an assessment from the neighboring Thailand's perspective and also an ASEAN perspective. ASEAN perspective does not necessarily represent the positions of each of its member state, but it has significant impact over the external recognition aspect of this election and this result. So Thitinan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yun. And hello, everyone. I can see here from the participants list, I can safely say that all of us here on this call are not happy with what's happening in Myanmar. And I think we've not been happy with what's happening in Myanmar over the last 5 years. I won't be more than 10 minutes. First, if you look at the timetable, going back to the coup, I mean, going back to even 2011, there's been kind of a trajectory, you know, a decade of kind of opening, reform, progress, yes, shortcomings, yes, flaws, but it was a decade of opportunities and promise. And then that was unplugged really by the coup on February 1st, 2021. It's been 5 years, unbelievable. But if you look at the 5 years, it has ebbed and flowed. I mean, who would have thought that there would have been a national revolt, national uprising, people taking up arms, rudimentary, you know, starting with the CDM and then the PDF and then eventually the NUG, AOs and the entire collective resistance. And then by late 2023, I mean, back and forth, it was a civil war, as we know. But late 2023, the resistance took the offensive, and by mid 2024, they could have declared a kind of a alternative government in Myanmar. I mean, the Myanmar military was on the back foot. If you count, you know, all the territories that were taken by the resistance coalition, the PDFs. I mean, you know, so all of this 5 years. I want to ask one question first of all. Where is the NUG? Who are the EAOs, EROs? Where are they? Now, I come to ASEAN now, and I'm going to come back to the EAOs, EROs, NUG. I mean, I think the resistance has been, the leadership of the resistance has been disappointing. They should have done much more with what they've done on the ground. The PDFs, you know, put their lives on the line. I mean, lots of people died in Myanmar. And the Tatmadaw, I mean, the Myanmar military regime, we know what it's about. That's not to be doubted. It's a heinous, kind of atrocious, brutal regime that really kind of stole power. I mean, deprived people from a decade plus of a better future. And that's not in doubt. We don't have to talk about how you know, heinous and disgusting and horrible these guys are, led by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. But what I want to talk about is, where is the opposition? Where is the resistance? All this time, all these years. I mean, they won a lot of victories on the battlefields. I mean, on the ground. I'm going to come back to that. ASEAN, you know, after all of this, I mean, I think China, even China, right? China took a step back. I think they were like, they weren't sure. They were happy. They were satisfied with the deal that they made. I mean, the status quo back, the status quo ante before the coup. I mean, they knew where Myanmar fit in the Chinese geostrategic jigsaw. They had the gas pipelines, they had the port, they had the the economic corridor. They dealt with Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, but then there was a coup. And the Chinese, I think, were taken aback by the resistance, by this the PDFs especially, right? So they really took the battle to Naypyidaw, Mandalay, Yangon. I mean, it was really nasty, but what a civil war. And so the Chinese by 2024, I think by mid 2024, they saw it. They needed an entity, authority and power, and that was the only authority and power had to be the Tatmadaw, the military regime, SSPC, now we call it. And they made their choice. They pressed the button and they, line up the various ethnic armies under their supervision and control, and they really kind of backed the military regime. Now, that turned the tide. And now I think with the US, with the Trump administration, the US has basically forfeited Myanmar with the withdrawal of AID, all this pullback, all this kind of Trump, Don Road, whatever you want to call it. But the US has lost any remaining moral authority in foreign policy, which means on Myanmar, it has no claim. I mean, the US is out. It's China's call. And this means, for the resistance, it's going to be a lot harder. For ASEAN, by the way, by this time, I thought the first thing this year, Foreign Secretary of Philippines, right, the chair this year, Teresa Lazaro, she went over to Naypyidaw. So I thought, okay, the Philippines is going to make a deal, and then the Philippines wants to focus on South China Sea, vis-a-vis China, and they even kind of sweep the Thai-Cambodian border clash under the carpet, and they want to focus on South China Sea, Code of Conduct, and COC, and so on. But then they had this Cebu retreat, and a little bit surprising to me that the joint statement, the joint communique that came out, in fact, ASEAN is still holding the line. ASEAN is still sticking to the 5-point consensus, which Min Aung Hlaing reneged. He signed on to it, but never abided by it, never complied with it. So it's really surprising to me that ASEAN actually is holding the line at this time. NUG or whatever resistance entity in charge should be rejoicing, should be jumping on it, should be on top of it. ASEAN is not accepting the elections in Myanmar. ASEAN is not accepting the election results in Myanmar. So the resistance should be saying, hey, ASEAN is not accepting it. Let's go on the offensive. Where is the NUG? Who leads the NUG? Who is in charge of the resistance? Who are the EAOs? I mean, ASEAN is actually doing them a favor here. And within ASEAN, by the way, as we know, it's been divided on a number of issues, South China Sea, Thai, Cambodian, Russia, Ukraine, even the Hamas, Israel, and all what Israel is doing in the Middle East and so on. But on Myanmar, very clear that those who are really sticking to it, sticking up for the 5-point consensus, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, I would say Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, in that order. And then, we have the 11th member. And to its credit, Timor-Leste is the one that is making a difference in ASEAN. Without Timor-Leste, I'm not sure how this would go, but Timor-Leste is not a big fan of the junta in Myanmar. So the 11th member is making an impact on Myanmar for ASEAN. I think now the ASEAN balance on Myanmar has tilted in favor of rejecting the election results. For the time being, they call this, I think that Lazaro said, as of now, right? So there's a time, there's a clock on it. There's a clock on it. So it doesn't last forever. So at this time, I mean, Min Aung Hlaing or the SSPC, they're not getting what they wanted. China will back this. China is backing it, and you have Laos, you have Vietnam, and Cambodia. But the bulk of ASEAN and Thailand wants to talk. I mean, I wouldn't say Thailand wants a deal, but I think Thailand wants to talk because I think Thailand sees a lot of problems along the border. And now Thailand is, it's got the border clash with Cambodia. It's got the Malay-Muslim ethnic ethno-nationalism in the south. It's got the transnational crimes and the scams and, the drugs and all this, the labor, migrant labor, and so on along the border with Myanmar, very long border. So Thailand, I think, Foreign Minister Sihasak, he coined this term, I think, calibrated engagement, which means that they want to interact. But ASEAN is sticking to the 5PC. So I think now we are in a kind of a still a conundrum. It's not the election was a foregone farce, right? We could have had this conversation, Yun, last year. I mean, we knew what the election would be about. It's a bogus election, and it's happened. It happened, and the results are just like what we thought it would be. But ASEAN has not caved in. This is really surprising to me. So I think now the ball is really in the court of the resistance. They have to get their act together. I don't know how they're going to do that, because the last 5 years they've been very disappointing. Don't hope on the US. I think the Trump administration, they will be very busy with the Western Hemisphere and Iran and all the rest of it. So the lack of morality in foreign policy for the US means they've forfeited Myanmar to China. But China also will rethink if the resistance can muster some kind of a offensive, organized leadership, and have a say for the future. They don't have that. And that's what I'm most disappointed at, and most, concerned and frustrated with. There are a bunch of other points, but I would say, first and foremost, as an upshot, where is the resistance? Who leads it? ASEAN is doing its favor now. ASEAN is not accepting the results, the election results. Being online doesn't just proceed, despite having the backing of China. And so now I think we are looking for leadership from the NUG. The people in this room, on this call, maybe should take up some positions. I don't know. But, there's an opportunity here that has not been lost, despite the fact that the bogus elections have taken place, despite China's backing, despite all what we've seen. The civil war continues, and I think the fight goes on, but the onus is really on the opposition, on the resistance to take the offensive, to come up with something. Thank you.
Thank you, Didinan. Thank you for that. Well, I should say, well-justified criticism for all the parties involved. I think, well, not to defend resistance, which has suffered a lot of internal splits and different disagreements within themselves, and also the lack of capacity. I think when we look at the resistance groups, we also have to be realistic about where they came from and the capacities that they currently have. So I think that's a potential issue that we could debate. As for what NUG could have done differently, given the constraint that they face, right? They're not a shadow government. They're not a government in exile. They basically exist in foreign countries. They don't have the resources to come on what is going on in the country. But I welcome our audience to also raise questions. But I really enjoyed how you criticize different parties and point out the weakness in their position. So before we go to the audience questions, I thought that maybe I can pose two questions, one for Mo and for Morgan, because there's some overlapping areas in this particular angle, and one to Ditinan. So for Morgan and Mo, Mo, you talk about military, and Morgan, you talk about the resistance. So looking down the road, we know the fighting is not going to cease after the election for sure. But if we look at the election and how it might have changed the military's mentality and how they could potentially feel more secure about their political standing, do you think a more secure Tatmadaw is going to be more aggressive vis-a-vis the EAOs, or they feel confident enough about their position and they could potentially be more interested in negotiation? just looking at the crystal ball here. And for DD9, well, being based in Washington, I would raise a slight disagreement on the assessment of U.S. foreign policy because for the Trump administration, it's very pragmatic. It's all based on U.S. national interest. And here, welcome your thought. Rare earths has been singled out as a key element of U.S. national security moving forward. And last summer, we saw the proposals, one by Sean Janelle and one by another business consultant, business interlocutor, that U.S. could look at Myanmar's rare earth minerals for potential alternative or substitution for its current overwhelming dependence on China for rare earth magnets. So I guess one could argue that if Trump administration, regardless of the moral authority and the ideological issue, but just look at practical national interest, wouldn't that justify a more forward-leaning approach on engagement with Myanmar? Well, engagement, quote, quote, we'll see which side it engages, but it would make a case for more engagement towards the country. So maybe I can go to Mo and Morgan first and come back to Professor Titinan later. Thank you.
Right. Okay, that's a really, really big question, Yun. About, the military now feeling more quote unquote confident because of this, close to 90% win and therefore feeling more secure. I'll try to link my thoughts to also what PJ observed about the ASEAN I guess the ASEAN dimension and the 5-point consensus. Because I think, well, the point about ASEAN holding the line, and we've been trying to, I guess, humbly suggest this, that ASEAN does need to hold the line on Myanmar. And holding the line in this context is really, the 5-point consensus as the only license to intervene as of now. And that's why we can say that the senior general has reneged on it, because he agreed to it and he reneged on it. Therefore, there is a cost of compliance. But linking that, now the 5-point consensus calls for ceasing violence, right? And humanitarian assistance to be delivered without discrimination, mediating dialogue, and all of that. Now, if any regime that emerges from this election exercise starts taking the 5-point consensus, quote unquote, seriously, to say that, okay, we're going to negotiate ceasefires and that's going to lead to ceasing violence and so on. So they may use any entry point as a negotiating point, and they will still probably think of using the ASEAN maneuvering space to, I guess, negotiate or bargain based on the more sympathetic views or attitudes that some ASEAN member states have towards the regime in Naypyidaw, for this kind of bargaining. So that's how I would view it in terms of, even if they hark back to the past decade of, reform, people really didn't sit up and take notice until the USDP regime post 2010, one, suspended the Myitsone Dam project, two, paved the way for the National League for Democracy, particularly Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, to re-enter politics as the legal opposition. And it was only then that there was this step-by-step consideration of will match action for action if the actions do lead to something that can be seen as, change that we can believe in. Forgive me for subverting a campaign message. I'm not subverting, quoting a campaign message from the past. But this is what I'm saying. I think we need to look at it in that context. This regime can draw on the institutional knowledge and expertise of people in the foreign service, in the civil service, and try to seek for more maneuvering space. not just internally, domestically, but using that also to get that maneuvering space regionally. So we do need to watch for that. And I take PJ's point of advice very seriously about we need to be aware. The broad array of Myanmar stakeholders do need to be aware and think about connecting the dots rather than, of course, holding on to principle to make the clear statements that they are making, but also I think in connecting those geopolitical dots. But then again, there's this point that both Nyanta and Amara made in the previous panel discussion about this current moment in Myanmar being more of an inward looking turn. And I think people are really assessing those internal challenges and capacities as well. Sorry, it's a bit rambling, but that's the point I wanted to make, linking the domestic with the regional imperative, whether it's the regime seeking maneuvering space or it's the resistance movement taking advantage of the maneuvering space that it has.
Great. Thank you for that elaboration. Morgan, some thoughts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as I said, for the Tamada, there will be some imperatives that there will be some conditions that must be met from its own security standpoint. So, for example, the Tamada, from its perspective, it needs to push the AA out of Magway. It cannot have AA forces on the doorstep of its defense industrial base. So there will be some fighting for sure. But I think, a lot also depends on the choices of the opposition and also the international community. The opposition, I say use this term broadly, but the opposition could preclude many Tamada offensives, at least temporarily, by being the ones to reach out and offer to engage in a peace process. That admittedly would have to meet many of the conditions that the Tamada itself sets. So, for example, the Tamada has said that it thinks a future peace process should still be modeled on the NCA. It's my view that if major EAOs were to reach out to the Tamada and offer to take part in that process, they may be able to thwart, at least for a time being, through careful manipulative maneuvering, some Tamada offensives. The Tamada may be willing to make some deals, again, for tactical or strategic reasons. For example, I think it's conceivable that the Tamada would accept granting de facto recognition to the AA in northern Rakhine if the AA agrees to withdraw from southern and central Rakhine. That's what the MNDAA did, right? It handed back Lashao in exchange for recognition of its authority over Special Region 1 or expanded version of Special Region 1. So again, I'm not saying that anyone is necessarily going to do these things, but the paths it's a complex web of potential interactions that affect one another. So I think it's hard to say whether or not the Tamada will lean towards negotiation or leans towards offensive. I think there'll be a combination. Some of it will happen in sequence. Some of it will happen simultaneously.
Great, awesome, and potentially will differentiate between groups that it will have to treat with more patience, and also groups that it believes that they can just push around, right? But I also want to agree that MNDAA can be an example, but it's also not just in exchange for political recognition, but also to have the Chinese remove their thumb from their neck. In terms of accepting the terms or give up Lashao. Titian, I hope my question was not too unrealistic. Do you think that U.S. has a vested interest in rare earths that Myanmar could potentially offer that will be potentially an access for or revenue for engagement? I think you're. Oh.
I'll address two questions. One is about the confidence. If Senior General Min Aung Hlaing feels more assured and confident, would he be more aggressive? Would he be more at ease to deal and negotiate and with the various ethnic armies? This time, he's got momentum now. he has got momentum now with China, with the elections, and not just China, but also, I mean, Russia, Belarus, and he feels like he has not just survived, he has outlasted. And this is also a theme, Yun, for some of these countries around here. If the incumbent power, authority and power can outlast and divide up the opposition, and then outlast them, they can keep surviving. And you can see this in Thailand, you can see this in Myanmar, a number of other countries. So I think Min Aung Hlaing now feels confident. Now, with this kind of confidence and momentum, and with the being accustomed to a long-standing, chronic, persistent civil war, I have a hard time imagining that he would be more, I don't know, at ease, relaxed, accommodating, I don't know, benevolent or agreeable. So I think that it would be the other way, that any negotiations and kind of talks that come up, or the civil war, the conduct of the civil war, most likely would be on his terms, rather than a kind of a more accommodating posture. The other question about rare earths, I mean, the US, I know you're in Washington, from our vantage point over here, the national security strategy of the US, the national defense strategy, you read that through, very clear. The US will be very busy, not just with Venezuela and the rest of it, and Greenland and all of that, but even the Middle East. So I think there will be some kind of a strategic accommodation with China. And I think it doesn't mean China's going to invade Taiwan, but it means smaller things. I mean, I don't know how far the US will be willing to stand up or stick up for the Philippines and South China Sea. Certainly the US, I don't think they have the resources or they have the bandwidth or attention to do the bidding in Myanmar. You mentioned rare earths. I mean, rare earths, I think, yes, I think the rare earths exports that China does, I mean, a lot of it comes from Myanmar, but where would the US start now? I mean, now that they have retrenched so much, China is all over Kachin State, I mean, Shan State. Where would the US even start? So I think that, yeah, rare earths important, and we don't know how much there is. It's a lot, it's significant, if not substantial. But the US, I just don't know if they have the bandwidth to get over here, to be engaged over here, given their focus, their geostrategic focus in the Western Hemisphere. And this means that China really is the game in town for all of us in Myanmar, but also for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia. For Myanmar, I do still think that if ASEAN can still stick up, there's a window, by the way, it's not going to last, it might not last a whole year. But, if the resistance can come up with something while the window still lasts and while the window is still opened, the Chinese are not, I think that they are very pragmatic. If, back in 2022, 2023, they were, thinking which way to go. But when they saw by 2024 that the resistance doesn't have what it takes to become the power and authority in authority, then they went with the military regime. So the US very hard, and I think resistance still got a chance.
Thank you for that note of hope. So for the next round of questions, we have three different questions for our speakers. For Mo, I think there's a question about whether the Myanmar resistance could use a face figure like Zelensky, like a strong leader that can unite different voices and can push forward the resistance as a whole, as a holistic campaign. For Morgan, there's a specific question about the arms shortages that are faced by the EAOs. I think that also came up during the first panel. Could you unpack that a little bit for us? So why is there suddenly a shortage of arms? Because the ongoing fighting has been ongoing for a very long time, right? And it escalated after 2021. So how come there's a sudden change in terms of the arms supply? Because you would assume that some of these supplies should be consistent. And for Professor Jijinan, really love your advice that the resistance could still got a chance. In your view or in your assessment, what do they need to do to capture that chance? And what would the end game look like? What should they be aiming for coming to, for example, at ASEAN or at other regional platforms? What should they do to capture that opportunity? So maybe we'll go to Mo first, if that is okay.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I think it was from Professor David Gamru. Thank you for the question. I wasn't sure it was directed to me, but I think this is, it shows this question really highlights the complex reality that is Myanmar's civil war and resistance situation. Of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it's a clear case of territorial sovereignty, and there was an elected president, President Zelensky, who could then try to rally support for the cause of his country pushing back against this foreign invader. And therefore, there were people, the focus, the attention of the response, the international response could coalesce around the presentations that are made, still continue to be made by President Zelensky. I recognize that Professor Gamru did mention Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and I think, in 2020, of course, basically, if there is a focal rallying point in the country for political, thoughts, expressions, it would have been Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. So the big difference here is, of course, since almost day one of the coup, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi has been put away and is not house arrest, it's prison. And, this is very different from even how the previous military regime treated the democracy leader. As under house arrest, she could still serve as that rallying point. She could still have interactions, albeit with a limited number of people. She could still meet with external interlocutors. That's not been the case since February 2021. And this highlights also, again, another complex reality of Myanmar's civil war situation, which has been going on since almost immediately after independence, with the different ethnic armed organizations really voicing what they want for their political future. And those broken promises actually date back to, the independence negotiations as well. So with this kind of decades of compounded type of, broken trust and promises, especially on the part of the ethnics, I think we are also seeing this in the way that, speaking to PJ's observation about the NUG, the resistance, it's a challenge, I think, for one particular group to say, I represent the broad spectrum of interest in Myanmar, when they are different, very specific sometimes interests. And when every, I think, aspiration is really coming out about what will be the political future that they want. And this is, I think, couched in the discussions that are around federalism, a federal democratic union. Now, the big question here is it federalism with a strong center, or is it a confederation with a weaker center? And that is something that I think the stakeholder meetings that different ASEAN chairs have been trying to do since 2023 with the different Myanmar political and ethnic stakeholders are trying to get at some parity before we can actually get them all into a dialogue. So I think this is the fundamental reality of the complex dynamics of, I guess, who represents Myanmar in a situation where it really has been all these, states and entities put together. That's, and I guess since 70 years ago, a very Burma Buddhist-centric military-dominated center tries to ram down people's consciousness as a union. So I think we need to look at the awakening after 2021 in that context as well. Sorry, I've taken a bit long, but this is something that I also like to think about as I continue my research.
Absolutely. That's really useful context. And also it's not just about one person, it's more about the whole campaign and the movement. Morgan, on the arms shortages question.
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, historically, there's two main weapons markets for Myanmar. One is along the Thai border, one is along the China border. So if you look at the groups that delivered the most devastating blows to the military, those are the groups, the northern groups that have access to the weapons market on the border with China. So after these groups made progress that was a bit more than China wanted them to, China has put pressure and taken action internally to consolidate a singular policy and bring all the different actors in China in alignment to ensure that this weapons market is not thriving in the way that it previously was. And they've also put pressure on the United Wa State Army, which also has some, I would say, manufacturing, if not assembly capacity. And they even released, I think, a statement saying that they wouldn't be able to, sell arms or support the opposition. So, generally the strategy that EAOs had adopted in the past couple of years, which was to not only fight in your own area, but then to supply proxy forces to go and fight in the center, that obviously requires a surplus in ammunition. And right now, the market is not totally depleted, but it's certainly constrained, which means that only those groups with the finances to purchase these weapons and ammunition that become incredibly expensive, they can outbid all the smaller groups. So that really has put a lot of pressure on this strategy of supporting proxy groups, because you don't have the money or even the access to weapons and ammunition that you need to pursue that proxy strategy. So the EAOs are just focused on stockpiling for themselves. The last thing I'll say is, without like a state-backed industrial defense capacity, offensives require years of stockpiling ammunition. 1027 was years and years of stockpiling ammunition. So, if there's enough for your daily needs, that doesn't mean there's enough to wage another massive nationwide offensive.
Thank you, Morgan. So a lot of pressure from China and also just the amount of arms that's required to launch a formal offensive against them. And I remember the statement you referenced that UWSA made. It was a very emotional message. Basically it says, we are under pressure. Please stop asking us for any type of supply, whether it's arms or financial. We will have to say no. So be considerate about our relationship. Don't put us in the position that we have to refuse you. So it was quite dramatic. We're coming to the end of the hour, but Gigi Dan would love to hear your thoughts, your advice to the resistance as for what they could do, what they should do in order to gain more momentum here.
Well, I mean, we over time, just 1 minute, if I may. I think they need, of course, they need voice and visibility. They need to really clean house. I mean, they need the kind of a new kind of leadership that's more assertive, more out there, and we've been missing that over the last, 5 years. At least the last 3 years, and that's very easy to say, very hard to do. I don't know if Aung San Suu Kyi is 80 now. I think one demand could be her unconditional release. I think this is something ASEAN can do on humanitarian grounds. She's not going to lead another kind of a movement, but she can be a kind of an umbrella, a figure that oversees some kind of a transition or a new kind of leadership. But the leadership of the resistance is key to me. That they need voice and need visibility. I think the arms supplies and limitations is a key dimension. And now with the U.S. retrenchment and despite the diaspora support, that still will be very difficult. So in the medium longer term, I think the military will have more and more upper hand, and I think the resistance now they have an uphill task, but it's not yet lost. They have to really. They've done a lot on the ground. They've gained a lot, and they've proved themselves. I think that just the leadership to me, and then if they can show, I think some gain, not just the battlefields, but in terms of legitimacy, credibility, that could still work for them, medium term.
Absolutely. Yes, agency needs to be worked on. Agency is not just there, and legitimacy is not just there without any claim or without any effort to consolidate it. So thank you so much all. Thank you for all your insights that have shared in this panel. We're going to invite you back. Please allow us the liberty to invite you back for future elaborations about what is evolving in the country and the implications are. Again, I also want to thank our audience for staying through this very intense discussion about the election and the domestic situation in Myanmar. Stimson Center is committed to convene these type of webinars focused on Myanmar regularly. Please do join us for our future iterations about the domestic changes in Myanmar. Again, thank you all very much. I hope you have a very good day and very good evening. Thank you and have a good day. Bye.